entering into what we would be learning today in this session. So we have around 10 to 12 slides that would walk you through in terms of what CCSP stands for, what are some of the domains or study material that ISC Square would be testing you on, what's the domain split in terms of where you can expect a question from, and then where to focus on for your exam. And then finally, I'll be sharing a couple of key pointers in terms of how you can tackle the syllabus, how you can make sure that your understanding is apt for the exam, and then what you can do during your preparation period to make yourself ready for the exam so that you can crack it in your first go. I'll share some tangible examples that I have personally used in my preparation and clearing the exam in the first go, as well as a few of my peers who've used the same tactics to be able to crack the exam. So before we dive into tangible pointers, we just want to do a quick recap of what CCSP stands for. As we all know, it's one of the most prestigious cloud security certification in the industry. This is hosted and developed by ISC Square, and ISC Square is one of those organizations that also holds the gold standard for cybersecurity certification called CISSP. And this is one of the best, if not the most recognized certificate in the cloud security space right now. So CCSP, as you can see, if you are a professional who's aiming to be an expert in cloud and especially in cloud security, this is a highly demanding certification. It's industry recognized because it's run by ISC Square, and their certifications are always bringing value to the individual and make sure that you've got industry recognition. It again, as you can see that people who are CCSP certified, they hold good titles. I've seen a lot of security solution architect, cloud security architects who've got CCSP certification, and that knowledge really helps you build your career around being an architect or holding a specialized certificate in cloud security. It does come with a prerequisite, as with some of the other ISC Square certification, around 5 years of cumulative paid work experience in information technology, and some of it needs to be in and around cloud security as well. However, if you do not have the prerequisites, you can still opt for the certificate and you can still get the title of an associate certificate or associate professional, and you still get a buffer time to accrue that requirement of work experience, and then you can finally get the full certificate as well. One thing that I wanted to touch upon as well for our attendees today is that CCSP is the prime certificate for cloud. However, it's also a great building block for your AI as well, because a lot of organizations that are using AI need a lot of compute, and cloud is a primary source of providing that compute and the resources that organizations need at scale. It's also visible that one of the bigger organizations or one of the bigger hybrid cloud provider or hyperscales that we call are the organizations that are actually doing really well in AI as well. So think about Google. They've got their own cloud, which is GCP, and they also have their own AI called Gemini. Similar to you might have all heard about OpenAI, right? ChatGPT, we all use. They have a bigger partnership with Microsoft Azure, and that's the cloud native solution that they use behind the scene, right? So you can see that all the AI is moving towards cloud, and if you can secure cloud, it's the stepping stone or the foundation on which AI is built. So you can have a longer, fulfilling career if you've got a CCSP certification under your belt. Now, a bit about the examination. So the examination itself currently today is 3 hours. It's multiple choice questions with a number limit of 125 questions, and you need to be able to score 700 out of 1,000 to be able to pass the exam. However, you would note that anybody who sits for the exam on or after 1st October 2025, which is 10-11 days from now, will be using or be tested on the CAT examination, which is the computer adaptive test. What that would mean is the candidate would be given between 100 and 150 questions. So your test can end at 100 questions or 150, depending on how the adaptive test goes. And then the timer on this would still be 3 hours. So in a way, if you are doing good on your exam, your exam would end in at 100 questions, and it can, however, go to 150 questions as well. So if some of you have been exposed to how CISSP exams were conducted, it's exactly the same pattern. In a way, it's easier because when I went through and gave the 125 questions exam, you still have to sit through and focus on everything. However, if you're passing and you've done really well in the 100 questions, you would sail through and don't have to sit for the next extra questions. So I see this as an advantage for people who are sitting on the exam. So with CCSP, what are your building blocks on study? How should one approach this study? And this pattern that I'm describing is for someone who doesn't have experience working or sitting ISC square examination. If you're the first timer, you could probably look at an easier effort of 3 to 6 months and dedicating no more than 10 to 15 hours a week for study and practice. The reason we say this gradually is because it has a lot of content. If you are not familiar with cloud or haven't done any ISC square examination, does need time to adapt, grasp, and then clear the exam. However, this is just a baseline for people who may not have experience or who have not gone through formal training. This can be reduced as well if you're doing some form of formal training with InfoSec or someplace else. And then if you're spending more time, of course, you can clear it in a shorter time. Domain-based learning is important. So you need to focus on one domain at a time. I've seen people jump in between content where today I'm reading about IAM, but the next day I'm reading about fundamentals of cloud. There's a reason why these domains are defined and cut by ISC square in such a way that the content flows in a way that it layers on top of each other, right? So sticking to that, understanding the fundamentals, going through domains one by one is really helpful. Then the third thing which is really important is it's an iterative review process. So because there's so much content, we tend to lose on some of the information that we've grasped from domain 1 when we review domain 5 and vice versa. So it's a process where you have to review the content multiple times, not just to understand it, but build a deeper connection between the information that would help you understand what the exam is asking you and how to answer that question. I'll talk about this later on in the presentation and give you some great pointers, right? Also, an important aspect with ISC square exam is practice, and the more practice you do, the better it is. With the CCSP certification, an advantage we have is there's a little bit of hands-on that you can do to test some of the concepts that are in the book. So it's not all theoretical. You can actually play with one of the cloud providers of your choice and then see some of those things in action, right? So key preparation tips and resources that you can look at, of course, the official study material from ISC Square, the Common Body Knowledge book is really good, and of course the official practice test. I see those three being a cornerstone of your preparation. In addition, it is very important for you to analyze the cloud security publication. They have uh, a book that you can download for free, which is used for their CCSK preparation. I would highly recommend that you go and review that book. We also have some standards from NIST, which are very important for you to understand the basics or the domain one, as well as we've got some industry white papers as well as documentation from cloud providers that can give you some guidance around having those hands-on practice for some concepts. Now, what are the 6 domains that CCSP is divided into and what's their weightage? So you can see fairly almost all the domains are on that 17% mark, with the exception of domain 2, which has a higher percentage, and it's one of those domains where if you don't put in the required amount of effort can actually uh, be the difference between you passing or failing the exam. Also, legal and risk, it's just 13%, but at the end of the day, everything ties back into risk. So having a focus on this domain really helps you identify, because at the end of the day, security is measuring risk, and if you can't define the risk associated with a specific technology or an action, you can't implement the right security controls, right? So that's where it is important. But these weightages are only a guideline in terms of how they're staged. What you need to understand is how ISC Square would test you in the exam is they would jumble up a question between multiple domains and test your knowledge on how well you understand the broader concepts, right? So it's not just about, hey, legal and risk, I'm going to specifically ask. The question can be jumbled together. And what I'm talking about is this diagram, which is very critical and important for you to understand. So what this is even though ISC Square broke down the entire syllabus into 6 domains, it's essentially one big domain, and for easier studies, they have cut it down into multiple chapters, right? Now, why they have done it is to make it easy for someone preparing for the exam to learn it in a systematic way. But when they test out your knowledge on those topics, they would mix those domains together to build up questions. An example that I've shown here is a company migrating to cloud needs to ensure data classification, which is a portion of domain 2, aligns with architecture design. Architecture design is covered in domain 1, and compliance, which is portion of domain 6. So you can see that an example question can cover multiple domains and then test your knowledge on how well you understand all of these different concepts. Again, cross-domain testing can also be important in testing domain 5, which is a very critical domain that covers security incident response, also your understanding of the application security and infrastructure security. So that's how they can club together different domains to build up a question. Now, just as an elaborated example, how we traditionally approach learning is we look at a definition, try and somewhat memorize it, and when there's a straightforward question, we just go back into the memory base of our brain and then pull out the definition, right? So for example, in terms of CCSP, you've got a capability called scalability, right? And what scalability is, the definition is there. It's new computing resources can be assigned and allocated without any significant additional capital investment, right? Very simple definition. Same way for elasticity, the definition is the flexibility of allocating resources as needed. And then we've also got cloud bursting, which is augmenting internal private data center capability with managed services during times of increased demands, right? All of these concepts are concepts that you would be exposed to in CCSP domain 1, right? They're all critical and important. Knowing the definition is your start to the journey of understanding what this is. However, where it becomes critical is when you're able to break that definition down into something like this. So in CCSP, if you can tell importance of a topic, what risk does that topic mitigate, what risk that topic itself introduces, as well as where would you use it. If you have that broader understanding just beyond the definition, that's where you would be able to pass the exam fairly easy. So now we've all looked at the simple definition of scalability, but the thing that we need to remember and how we need to train our brain is scalability is important when you have a system that needs to handle increased workload. That means it needs to scale. If you're running an application and you have 10 users, all of a sudden there are 100 users, you should be able to scale out. That's scalability for you. Now, that definition didn't tell us that there are different types of scalability. So there's vertical scalability, which helps you with CPU and RAM of the existing machine. But there is horizontal scaling where you can add more machines itself, right? Now, what's the characteristic? This is the important portion, because when you go into the exam and there's a scenario, because all the questions would be scenario based, IC square traditionally does not test a direct memory based question. They would more or less be testing your knowledge and understanding of the concept. So lengthy questions defining use cases, right? So this is where you understand that if scalability is there, the characteristic of planned capacity expansion is what you need to connect that with. And then what's the security implication? It's consistent security controls across the scaled resource. So that's the risk. Remember, I said the risk that this solves as well as the risk that itself generates. So when you scale something, if I have one computer, if I have two computers, I want to make sure that both of them have the same security controls. If I have 1 to 1,000 machines, I want to make sure that my security controls propagate everywhere, right? Similarly, elasticity. So a lot of people get confused during the exam, what scalability versus elasticity. So elasticity is always remembering as a rubber band, right? So a rubber band can stretch, but when you leave it, it comes back to its original place. However, scalability is just stretching it out, right? So for example, elasticity is when you auto provision, and that's the difference. Scalability is we discussed manually, where you add more resources. Elasticity is automatic provision and deprovision of resources. So you can see that words are very similar, but a little bit of difference in the definition. And these are the things that ISC Square would want you to focus on to be able to understand what they're asking, as a result be able to answer the question correctly, right? So again, as I said, building on that framework of ensuring you know what it is supposed to do. So you said dynamic resource allocation is what you would need. So anytime you see auto scaling as a query, you should be probably going towards elasticity as one of the key concepts that they're discussing, right? and then it's bidirectional because you can scale up and scale down because it's elastic. So you can stretch the rubber band and the rubber band can come back as well, right? Key characteristic is automated response to workload changes, right? And then security implications is that when you scale out or scale in, those policies to the different resources should stay the same, right? Now, what does scalability and elasticity have in common for cloud bursting? The different technologies, terminologies, right? But that's how all of these club together to form one big service, right? So what happens is when an organization, and we've all seen organizations that have big sales running in maybe the time of Diwali or any other big festival, right? So now organizations cannot go and buy all of that uh, extra resource just for the holiday season. This used to be a practice 10 years ago where there was no other capability, but what would happen is the organization would buy a lot of hardware or compute capacity just for a festive season, and then entire year that capacity would stay there not used. But with cloud bursting, because we've got elasticity and scalability, scalability comes from the provider. So if you go to AWS or Azure and say, I need 10 virtual machines, they would give it to you right away. If you say, no, I just have a business is growing, I need more, I want 100, they would give you. But what they would do is they would have that scalability configured in their backend. They would have those resources stacked so that when you need them, you can get them. So you would use elasticity to increase and decrease, and cloud burst is the overall definition. So when an organization for specific time period, which is like a festival season, go to the cloud or use another data center, can be private as well, to say, hey, I want to borrow resources for X amount of time, and then when I don't need it, I won't use it, and then you don't charge me. Just charge me for the time that I use. And that's the essence of cloud burst. So you can see that scalability is feeding into elasticity. Elasticity is what is being used for cloud burst. They're key different technologies, but they're working together to provide you one solution. And that's how you need to build your knowledge in CCSP. Right? Now, this is a slide that shows you what I've discussed is around understanding the base, because if you see scalability foundation provides you the fundamental capability to handle growth. Remember I said how you just went to your provider and said, give me 1 machine, 10 machine, now 1,000 machine because my business is growing. So what allows provider to give you that capability is the foundation, which is scalability. Now, what you use to have those resources automatically provisioned is elasticity. And when you can use elasticity, an example is cloud burst. So real example scenario is e-commerce is a great example. Scalability is website designed to handle 10x or 10 times of normal traffic, right? Elasticity is when auto scales during peak hours. So your website automatically identifies and says, okay, I've got 10,000 users coming in and now I've got 100,000 users coming in, I would scale automatically. Cloud burst is when you use it for festive seasons. You know that there's going to be more traffic, so you know what you need to provision, right? So that's how some of these concepts tie together. Now, the key aspects, if you were to learn something from this session, this is the most important slide, right? Top number one takeaway from this session would be have good solid understanding of the concepts, right? understanding of the concepts, not learning the concepts, right? So as we saw in the previous slide, the definition of scalability is only to lay the foundation, but you need to understand exactly why scalability, who uses it, who provides it, what's the risk, why am I using it? All of that needs to be understood, not just the definition, right? Second is understanding of risk and mitigation associated with each concept. The sooner you get into the practice, the better it is for you to be able to crack the exam, because the questions will automatically tell you the risk, and then you'll have an easier way to identify the answer. Third, and the most important aspect, is practice question, but practice in a very specific way. You have to make the most of the questions, because I've seen people do 1,000, 2,000, 3,000 questions for CCSP and still fail the exam because they are approaching the questions in the wrong way. So, how to do it correctly? First, slowly read the question. Even if you know the answer, read the question properly. Second is understanding clearly the ask of the question. Sometimes you may be able to identify the answer, but you may not know exactly what the question is asking. So make sure that you have clarity on what topic the question is from, what exactly from CCSP is this question pointing to. Is it pointing to a risk? Is it pointing me towards a solution? What is the question asking? Right? So when you practice, build this muscle memory. In the exam, this would be really important so that you can figure out the right answer. Use the elimination process not only in the exam, it's a must to be able to pass the exam that you use the elimination process, but a thing that you do not practice will be very difficult to implement in the exam. So same way, elimination process, you have to start using it when you are doing the practice question, even if you know the answer directly, right? Because practice questions do not have the same level of complexity as the complexity in the exam. So you need to make sure that you are simulating that environment as close as possible. Another key and important aspect is wrong questions during practice are more important than the correct ones. When you get a question wrong, you need to dissect and spend time on it, and just don't need to remember that, hey, I got this question wrong, this was the answer. What you need to do is go and deep dive into it and understand, why did you get that question wrong? What was the question asking? Why did you pick answer X and why was answer Y? The moment you can do this, a lot of concepts will start becoming clearer to you. As a result, the exam would be very easy for you, right? So make sure that the wrong questions that you get, you go back, read the response as well as the explanation. So the official practice guide has explanations on why one answer is better than the other. And this is also an important thing that you need to understand how ISA Square would ask you questions. Sometimes they would ask you find out the better mechanism or the best method. Sometimes they would ask you first, which means in a sequence they're asking you which is the first. Sometimes they would ask you what comes next or what came before. So you need to understand what are they asking and where. If it's a cyclical thing, like you've got data cycle, you've got SDLC, if those are the kind of questions, if it's incident response, you may want to know which stage you are in and what is either the next stage that they're asking, or sometimes they would ask you what would you have done previously, right? So you need to understand all of that, not just from a theory point of view, but also understand the overall process in depth. Another important aspect, which is you need to be able to practice before the exam to be able to sit in an exam environment for 3 hours and doing questions. That's why when I teach this session, or a lot of us teach this session in InfoSec, we give you practice questions that allow you to sit for maybe 3 hours, simulate the exam around 125 questions. You try and solve that in 3 hours and make yourself accustomed to being there for 3 hours, because trust me, the amount of focus that this needs, if it's broken, it's difficult for you to refocus again, right? And it's time bound, so we need to ensure that you cross across the 100 question mark. That's absolutely important in the CAT based environment. Now, what is it that you get when you partner for your CCSP journey with InfoSec, right? So we help you develop the practice of understanding concepts. So you've seen one example of how I'm breaking down uh, definitions into tangible information that you can remember. When you do questions, it would pop out. Okay, this is talking about a provider, and provider are responsible for scalability. So that's what the question could relate to. But if it is like, hey, the organization is trying to make sure that they've got enough coverage in, uh, let's say, December, and you know it's a festival season thing, then you know it's maybe pointed towards cloudburst, right? So understanding those concepts, knowing examples, that's how we try and teach. Then, as I said, everything has a risk matrix around it. There's a reason why the security control exists. So understanding what the risk is can give you an idea and tell you exactly what the security control and the mitigation should be. So for example, if you're concerned about data breach, encryption is a good response for you. DLP and access control bridge together and build a strong foundation, right? So anytime you see if the question is saying data breach is a risk, you know these could be possible options for mitigation if that's what the answer has, right? So you get an idea and you get a strong foundation built. Second is when I said practice question and make the most of them. So slowly reading, making sure that you've got those uh, keywords identification ingrained in your play. So for example, a company wants to implement data classification. So this is a key characteristic or a word that would we want to focus on, right? And they're concerned about compliance with GDPR. So these are the key elements that you would want to remember: data classification, GDPR compliance, multi-cloud, right? Second is understand clearly the ask of the question. Is the question saying best approach versus what's done first? So cyclical things would be important for you to understand. Third one is use the process of elimination. So with multiple choice question, usually if you've gone through the study material and have a good grasp, eliminating two becomes very easy. So out of four possible questions, figuring out two is relatively easy. How you get to the final answer will depend on a combination of one and two as well. So how well you understood the question, have you figured out the right keywords in the question that it is asking for, right? So that's important. And as I said, learning paradox, important to learn from what you've got wrong, understanding where you went wrong, dissecting where that knowledge gap is. So sometimes it's important for you to be true to yourself and say, okay, I've got this question wrong and I have no clue why I picked the wrong answer. Sometimes it's easier that you were in between two answers and you've picked the one that's necessarily not the best. As a result, it's wrong, which is fine. That's a state where we want to be, where we can at least eliminate two easily. And if we are in between two, that's where the learning continues to grow, and that's where practicing more questions will help you solidify that, right? Now, sitting in the practice, again, as I said, building stamina, ensuring that you are doing at least 1 to 2 practice tests before the exam, leading up to the week before the exam, and then making sure that you've got that mental stamina to sit there for 3 hours. Now, in terms of the overall strategy, right, we said practice makes a man perfect. So, as a result, doing multiple practice exams and questions, hands-on labs where possible, join the study group. So we at InfoSec will also have a study group where you can work with peers who are also planning for the exam. So having that group really helps you gear up to the exam, right? Current exam, just a recap, is still at 125 questions for 3 hours. However, I envision anybody in this group is probably going to take it after 1st of October. If so, then be ready for the CAT version. I think if you're well prepared, it can work in your favor because the exam can end and you can pass in just 100 questions. Again, it's same multiple choice format. On the exam day, make sure that you take your correct IDs, read the question carefully, flag difficult questions, which is one thing that you need to remember is not available with IC Square, right? So a lot of people who've gone through different type of certification that allow you to go back and forward or mark questions, that is not something that's possible with IC Square exam. This is the key reason I've included it here. You cannot do this in the exam. And manage your time effectively. It's a time-based exam as well. You don't want to run out of the timer. At least reach the 100 question. And then final preparation, practice test, review weak areas, get adequate rest, and prepare all your documentation. Right? So now, a key takeaway, this exam is one of those difficult exams. However, with proper training, effort, and understanding, it can become an easier exam to crack if you've done the correct due diligence, right? The amount of people attempting this exam and passing has increased, or that ratio has improved. However, there's still a lot of people who do the same mistake and sometimes find it difficult to pass it in 2 attempts, 3 attempts. I've seen people who've attempted the exam 3 times and they say, I don't know what questions are being asked. I haven't learned those topics. And it's just that the topics are the same, they're either worded in a different way and they're not able to find the crux of what the question is asking. So it's an equally important English reading exam. So you need to be able to understand and interpret what's being asked to be able to clear this exam. The upside of this certification is that you become a prime candidate for any cloud security related work. As I said, AI is what's going to use cloud and continue to get focus from a lot of organization, and their investment is going to keep going into cloud. So having this under your belt makes you a very good candidate for an organization that's looking to hire cloud security professional.